Can neutrality genuinely exist in a region that constantly teeters on the edge of war, or is it merely an illusion, a facade hiding deeper intentions? As tensions between Iran and Israel continue to escalate, the Arab Gulf states have asserted their position, reassuring Iran of their neutrality. Yet, in the world of geopolitics, where alliances shift and stakes are high, can nations genuinely remain neutral? And when nations like the US take clear sides, how can the Gulf states uphold their stance? Let's explore. In recent diplomatic meetings in Doha, Gulf nations emphasize their neutrality to Iran, underscoring their intent to avoid entanglement in this escalating conflict. Why is this so important to them? For decades, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain, have witnessed the severe consequences of being drawn into regional conflicts. The Middle East has long been a geopolitical battleground where global powers seek influence, resources, and strategic footholds. From colonial interventions to Cold War-era proxy wars, the region has borne witness to foreign manipulation, often leaving local populations to grapple with the aftermath. These experiences have deeply shaped the Gulf nations' current desire for neutrality, a stance rooted not just in diplomacy, but in survival. One primary reason behind the Gulf states' insistence on neutrality is the desire to prevent their territories from becoming battlegrounds for foreign wars. The scars left by previous conflicts, especially the Gulf Wars, remain fresh in the minds of Gulf leaders. During these conflicts, nations like Iraq and Kuwait saw their territories ravaged by violence, with foreign military bases springing up as uninvited guests. Kuwait's devastation during the 1990 Gulf War serves as a stark reminder of the costs of involvement in large-scale conflicts, a lesson the Gulf states have taken to heart. These countries have learned that allowing foreign powers to use their lands as launching points for military operations against regional neighbors can have devastating long-term consequences. This time, they are drawing a firm line in the sand, making it clear that no foreign troops will launch attacks on Iran from Gulf soil. This assurance to Iran goes beyond symbolic gestures. The Gulf states have taken concrete steps to communicate their stance, utilizing diplomatic channels to emphasize their neutrality. Although these Gulf states host U.S. military bases, including the strategic Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, Gulf leaders have clarified that these bases are not to be used as staging grounds for offensive actions against Iran. On one hand, they need to maintain security relationships with the West, particularly with the U.S., which provides crucial defense support. On the other, they need to reassure Iran that they are not complicit in any aggression. These assurances hold significant value for Iran, which has a long history of viewing foreign military bases near its borders as potential threats. From Iran's perspective, the presence of U.S. forces in neighboring Iraq, Afghanistan, and across the Gulf region is a long-standing point of contention. These bases are often perceived as launching points for regional operations, adding to Iran's sense of encirclement. The Gulf states' neutrality, therefore, provides Iran with a degree of reassurance, at least temporarily, that it will not be surrounded by hostile forces poised to strike. Another reason for Gulf neutrality lies in the recognition of the broader consequences of the Iran-Israel conflict. Gulf leaders understand that the stakes extend beyond the immediate parties involved. They recognize the gravity of the situation and the ease with which a regional conflict could spiral into a global catastrophe. The Middle East has long been a tinderbox where even a small spark can ignite a larger conflagration, and the involvement of global powers often turns localized conflicts into international crises. The Gulf nations are keenly aware that aligning too closely with one side could push the conflict beyond regional borders, potentially triggering a new world war. They understand that, in a worst-case scenario, the United States, Russia, China, and other global powers, each with vested interests in the Middle East, could be drawn into the conflict. Maintaining neutrality, therefore, serves as a strategic move to prevent further escalation and mitigate the risk of drawing in additional international actors. Neutrality also serves a larger purpose for the Gulf states, fostering regional unity. The Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC nations, have made significant efforts in recent years to strengthen unity among Arab states. They realize that division within the Arab world only weakens their collective bargaining power on the global stage. The Iran-Israel conflict has the potential to further fracture Arab unity, a risk that the Gulf states are determined to avoid. By remaining neutral, they hope to prevent the conflict from becoming a wedge that drives Arab nations apart. Furthermore, the Gulf states' commitment to neutrality is driven by pressing economic concerns. Their economies, heavily dependent on global oil markets, would suffer devastating consequences if oil production were disrupted due to conflict. Gulf leaders are acutely aware of the risks involved in being drawn into a military confrontation. The 2019 attack on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, allegedly carried out by Iran or its proxies, highlighted the vulnerability of Gulf oil infrastructure to regional conflicts. Given these risks, Gulf states have every reason to avoid direct involvement in the Iran-Israel conflict. They understand that any participation in the conflict could result in retaliatory strikes on their oil infrastructure, potentially triggering a global energy crisis. Neutrality, in their view, is the best way to protect their economic interests and ensure that their oil facilities remain unscathed. But how do the Gulf states hope to prevent this conflict from escalating into a global war? At the heart of their strategy is diplomacy. The Gulf states have consistently positioned themselves as mediators in regional disputes, often hosting peace talks and acting as intermediaries. Qatar, for instance, has played the role of mediator in various disputes, from Lebanon's political crisis to negotiations between the Taliban and the US. This track record of diplomacy is integral to their strategy of avoiding escalation. The Gulf nations recognize that neutrality is not a guarantee of safety. Even if they remain neutral, there is always a risk that their oil facilities could become targets in the event of an escalation. Iran, for example, has hinted that it could target the oil infrastructure of nations perceived to support Israel or the West. For the Gulf states, neutrality is a way of ensuring they are not dragged into the conflict, protecting both their oil infrastructure and economic future. However, the Gulf states also face long-term challenges related to their reliance on oil. The global shift towards renewable energy is pressuring oil-producing nations to diversify their economies. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 plan, for example, aims to reduce the kingdom's dependence on oil by investing in sectors such as tourism, entertainment, and technology. Yet this transition will take time, and in the meantime, the Gulf states remain heavily dependent on oil revenues. In the end, the Gulf states' decision to remain neutral in the Iran-Israel conflict is a strategic move to safeguard their interests and avoid being drawn into a larger war. Whether this neutrality will hold in the face of escalating tensions remains uncertain. But for now, they hope that by staying neutral, they can protect their economies, foster regional unity, and prevent the conflict from spiraling into a global crisis. Do you believe neutrality is the best approach? Will it lead to a resolution in the conflict, or is it simply a temporary measure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in more content on the geopolitics of Africa and the Middle East, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon to stay updated.